I'm getting bored here. Alright guys, it's enough.
Booze and booze.
I spent several of my summers volunteering as an assistant scout leader for a troop that camped all over the state. Most of the stories people would tell about scouting involved snakes, bears, storms, or kids doing incredibly dumb things with pocket knives, which I did see plenty of. But this isn't one of those stories though, it's a little different. The camp itself sat deep in the woods along a ridgeline with this steep ravine running beside it on one section of the campsites. We called it the Steeps. Years before, the camp had installed guardrails and warning signs because the drop was sharp enough to break an ankle if somebody slipped, and if you roll beyond that, well, you could possibly die. It started dangerous and became fatal the further down you went. On our second evening there after dinner and before the lights went out, a group of older boys came jogging back toward camp carrying something they'd found near the railing. "What is that?" I asked them. And one of them held it up. It was a doll. And not the kind that you'd buy today. This thing looked incredibly old. Its face was stained brown and gray, one eye was missing, and patches of dirty yellow hair still clung to its cracked plastic head. The dress that had once been pink was now faded and almost white. It looked like something that had been lying in the woods for nearly 25 years or more. Naturally, every scout within a 100-foot radius gathered up around it, and the reactions were immediate. "Yo, that's creepy, dude. Put it down. No, put it back. Why would somebody bring that here?" One kid, of course, immediately claimed it was haunted. Another said it probably belonged to a dead child. And that comment earned him a lecture from me about keeping his imagination under control. It's fine to joke around, but that was taking it to a place that would keep all the other kids up at night. Truthfully though, I didn't like looking at the thing either. There was just something unsettling about finding a child's toy in the middle of nowhere. It didn't belong there. I figured maybe some camper had tossed it years ago and just forgot about it. Things fall out of trucks on these trails every weekend. It's pretty normal. "All right," I said. "Enough, leave it alone." Most of the boys would drift away, but a few kept staring at it, and eventually, one of the older scouts picked it up with 2 fingers. "Can I throw it back?" "What?" "Back into the ravine. Nobody wants it, right?" I guess that wasn't really exactly the scout handbook answer, but I was tired and the sun was about to go down. "Yeah, that's fine," I said. "Then make sure you leave it there, and we'll call it a proper burial, whatever." Some of the kids whooped and hollered their approval and followed the kid with the doll. They walked to the railing and tossed it in, and we all watched. A bunch of them actually clapped as it disappeared. Gone. And that was really the last thing we did before settling in for the night. The evening passed pretty normally. We had our campfire program, reviewed the next day's activities, and eventually sent everybody to their own tents. By 10 o'clock, the campsite was quiet except for insects and the occasional distant owl. I made my rounds, checked that everybody was where they belonged, and were going to sleep. Sometime after sunrise, I was jolted awake by screaming, and not like, "Oh, there's a spider in my tent" kind of screaming. I mean, real blood-curdling shrieks. I sat upright and immediately heard multiple voices shouting from the youth campsite. For a brief moment, I really thought somebody had been bitten by a snake or something, so I threw on my boots and took off. Several of the scouts were standing near the outside of one of the tents pointing inside. 2 of them looked genuinely pale, clammy, and terrified. "What's going on? What happened?" Nobody answered me. One boy just pointed. I dug through the tent flap and froze. Sitting neatly in the center of the tent floor was the doll, the one with the missing eye, sun-bleached dress, and clumpy hair. For several seconds, I simply just stared at it. Then I walked over and picked it up. The plastic was cold, which was very bizarre. I turned it over looking for some kind of clue that it wasn't the same one, but it really was. "It wasn't there last night. I swear it wasn't. We zipped the tent shut. We didn't do it. One of the scouts was close to tears. I spent the next 20 minutes or so trying to solve what I assumed was a prank. That had to be the only answer. One of the boys must have climbed back into the ravine after dark, retrieved the doll, slipped it into the tent while everybody else was distracted. Case closed, right? Except there were problems. First, nobody admitted to doing it. That alone obviously isn't unusual. The strange part, though, was that nobody accused anybody else either. These kids were scared, and when shit hit the fan, they usually ratted each other out immediately, but not this time. Second, the tent occupants had gone to bed before full darkness. There hadn't been much opportunity to do this. I would have seen them with a flashlight cutting through the camp after everybody had gone to sleep. Third, the doll itself was filthy, caked in mud. There must be water at the bottom of the ravine or something. I checked the shoes of several boys who had been near the ravine the previous evening, and nobody had fresh mud on them. Nobody had scratches from crawling through brush. Not definitive proof, but it was weird. Eventually, I just kind of gave up trying to investigate it. I told everybody that was some kind of prank, confiscated the doll, and threw it into a dumpster near the camp office later that morning. Problem solved, at least officially. But I remember carrying that thing across camp and looking down at its cracked base, and I felt something I've never felt before. Hatred might be the right word. I felt like this doll hated me, and still, despite being in my hand for 10 or 15 minutes at this point, it was still icy to the touch. Maybe somebody did climb down there after dark and they were committed enough to keep this joke secret for all these years. That's the explanation I've stuck with, because anything else is beyond explainable. A few years ago, our Boy Scout troop spent a week at a summer camp up in the mountains. Others will tell you, but camp feels completely separate from the real world once you're there. There's no phones, no parents, just pine trees, dirt trails, merit badge classes, and a bunch of teenage boys running around trying not to be last. That's where we ended up starting to call Seth Nightcrawler. The nickname obviously came from the X-Men character who could teleport. It started as a joke, but by the end of the week, nobody was laughing about it anymore. We were witnessing the paranormal, no two ways about it. The first time it happened, a group of us were sitting around a campfire before breakfast. Seth was there with us, slouched in a folding chair beside the fire ring. He wasn't talking, which I guess wasn't unusual. He was a quiet kid who always seemed slightly detached from whatever was going on around him. The breakfast bell rang and everybody started heading toward the dining hall. I remember looking back because Seth hadn't gotten up yet. He was just sitting there, staring into the cold ashes. 10 minutes later, we walked into the dining hall, and Seth was already inside eating pancakes. A couple of us stopped dead in our tracks. Weren't you just at camp? Seth looked up at us. I came here. That's all he said. Things like that kept happening all week, though. We'd leave him sitting at camp and then find him at the trading post. We'd see him across camp and somehow he'd already be waiting somewhere else before there was enough time for him to get there. The weird part, though, was that he never looked rushed, never sweaty, never out of breath. If he was disheveled, it almost would have been funny, but the fact that he wasn't seriously creeped us all out. A few of us began to start taking notes and comparing them. One kid swore he saw Seth sitting at camp while the other claimed he'd been standing outside the dining hall at the exact same time. The more we paid attention, the less sense it made. There were other things too. Sometimes you'd catch him staring. You'd look up and find him already watching you from across camp. No expression on his face or smile, just staring. Then he'd slowly look away and find somebody else to stare at. One night around the campfire, I caught him doing it. The flames were reflecting in his eyes. When he noticed that I'd seen him, he smiled. And I swear I watched the firelight reflection die right there in his pupils. A dancing orange flame, then boom, nothing, just endless black looking back at me. I'll admit it wasn't threatening, but it was unsettling, challenging, as if he wanted somebody to mention his strangeness or something. A couple of days later, I was sitting across from him at lunch. The seat beside him was empty despite the dining hall being packed. I asked if anybody was sitting there. He looked at the chair, then over at me. Sometimes. I waited for the rest of his answer, but he didn't explain. So I moved on and found somewhere else normal to sit. But the strangest encounter happened on a Thursday afternoon. Most of the troop was scattered around camp at merit badge classes. I stayed behind because my stomach was bothering me. For nearly an hour, I was completely alone at our campsite reading beneath a tree. Then I heard something and I figured the crew had earned their badge and were rolling back into camp. I looked up and saw Seth was entering the campsite from this far trail. I checked my watch. He was supposed to be in environmental science. I knew because I'd seen him heading there earlier, and that was the longest course of the day. Maybe he had to go to the bathroom or something? He walked straight through camp, not toward me, nor the bathroom, nor any tent. Just straight through camp. Seth. I had to call out and see if something was wrong, but there was nothing. He just kept walking. So I stood up. Hey, Seth. Much louder this time, still getting no response. He passed within 20 feet of me, close enough that I could see the freckles on his skin, but he never turned his head and never even acknowledged me. Just simply walked across the clearing, then disappeared down the opposite trail. Up until then, I assumed he was taking shortcuts or messing with people somehow. But something about how he came through was just seriously bizarre. I didn't feel like he ignored me, more like he couldn't sense me at all, if that makes sense. It was like we were in totally different dimensions and I just happened to see him for a second. That evening, I finally asked him about everything. We were filling canteens before dinner. How do you keep doing this? He glanced over at me. Doing what? Showing up everywhere. He just stared at me, then he smiled. You see me because you're looking. I laughed. Dude, what does that even mean? His smile then disappeared. I don't know, but you're the only one looking. He said this very, very seriously and then walked away, and that was the longest conversation I'd had with him all week. Friday night was the final campfire. Everybody was joking around and trading stories. At one point, I noticed Seth several rows away watching the flames. He looked strangely pale in the firelight, and for a second I thought he actually looked sad. Then somebody walked in front of me, broke my line of sight, and when I looked back, he's gone. Judging by how pale and upset he looked, I thought maybe he got sick and jumped up to go to the bathroom or back to his tent. The next morning, we packed up and boarded the buses home. I distinctly remember seeing him sitting near the rear window. I remember because he looked directly at me as we pulled away from camp. When we arrived back at the church parking lot, parents were waiting by the dozen. Everybody piled out and started getting their gear and personal belongings. For a few minutes, I realized I guess I hadn't seen Seth. Where was he? Or maybe I assumed his parents were running late or something. Eventually, I walked over to Scoutmaster while he was unloading equipment. Hey, where's Seth at? He looked at me confused, almost distraught. Seth? Yeah. The Scoutmaster looked at me. Seth wasn't here. I crinkled my brow. What do you mean? He was supposed to come, but his mom called before we left and said he was sick. I stared at him. No. Yeah, son. I talked to him at camp, though. The Scoutmaster frowned at me. Look, buddy, I don't really know what to tell you, but Seth wasn't on this trip. I announced all the absentees at the start of the trip. Do you not remember that? I couldn't believe him. I turned around, scanned the bus, the parking lot, any sign of proof, but there was nothing to find. Years and years have passed now since that camp, and every now and then I still pull out the photos. There's hundreds of them. Campsites, merit badge classes, dining hall, campfires. I know exactly where Seth should have been standing in several of these pictures because in some of them, he was standing next to me. I I'd attended Northwood summer camp several times as a scout before finally getting the chance to come back on staff. I was 13, proud of the staff shirt that was on my back, and convinced I was basically now an adult. The camp sat on this beautiful lake in northern Michigan, surrounded by endless pine forest. The staff members stayed in the cabins instead of tents, which felt like a luxury accommodation to us. There was this cabin, though, that nobody seemed to use. The first time I took note of it, I was carrying supplies with another member when we passed by. The windows were dark, the door stayed shut. It looked like every other cabin except for one thing. Nobody ever went near it. So I gotta ask, what's up with this one? I said. The older kid helping me glanced over at it and immediately looked away. Don't worry about it, man. But naturally, I kept asking. Eventually, one of the older staff members told me a story. Years earlier, according to camp legend, a kid had joined staff and become obsessed with dark occult type of stuff. Strange symbols started appearing around the campsite, eventually covering the walls of one particular cabin. The carvings became so extreme that he was removed from staff and sent home, and nobody wanted to nor slept in that cabin afterward. A few nights later, just before sunset, I talked to two other young staff members into going over there with me. The door wasn't locked, and the moment we stepped inside, I'll admit the place felt heavy with all this bad energy. It smelled dusty and full of rat poop. And at first, everything looked pretty normal until I saw the corner. Somebody had rearranged the bunks years earlier, creating this enclosed section of the wall. The stories hadn't exaggerated, even a single detail. The wood was covered in these carvings, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. Some were scratched lightly while others were cut so deep that chunks of wood had splintered away. Black and red marker covered sections of the walls. Circles, stars, sagged symbols, and pentagrams. Strange figures over words nobody could recognize. The whole corner looked like a peek inside a psycho's head. One of the guys that was next to me muttered, "Nope," and then proceeded to walk right out of the cabin. The rest of us remained for less than 5 minutes, and I did my best to clear it from my head. Later that night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a tapping sound. I sat upright. Tap, tap. The sound was coming from outside the cabin, and then it moved somewhere else, but it did it again. Tap, tap, tap. Like somebody was walking around the exterior wall, banging their knuckles up against the wood. I slowly climbed down from my bunk and looked out the window. Didn't see anything though, just darkness and trees. The tapping had stopped, and I chalked it up to an animal roaming by and went back to bed without any issue. The next night, though, it happened again, and this time it came directly beneath my window. Tap, tap, tap. I lay there frozen in bed for what felt like hours. When dawn broke, I was already dressed and hustled over to the breakfast fires. I couldn't help myself. Started asking about the weirdness that I experienced over the last couple of nights. Apparently, every single person in the cabin had heard it. Worse yet, nobody had a reasonable explanation. The third night was far worse. I woke up to the sounds of footsteps running outside, fast, circling the cabin. There were several other staff members that were sitting up too, half-sleeping figures in the darkness of the shared cabin. The footsteps stopped directly outside, then came this long scraping sound across the wall. It traveled slowly from one end of the cabin to the other, like nails on a chalkboard. Nobody slept much after that. We put together some foot patrols and really started leaning on the actual scoutmasters. They had zero interest in getting to the bottom of it though. The plan was just to finish out the week and get everybody home. Cut to the following evening, I found myself staring toward that abandoned cabin during dinner. I swore something moved near it, a figure, tall, motionless, standing beside the building. I blinked, but the figure remained. I grabbed another staffer and asked, "Hey, who is that?" He looked, and of course the space was empty. In that moment, I felt my brain slowly fragmenting. I let the staffer go and then just tried to pretend like it didn't happen. That night, I woke up again. Cabin was pitch black. Tried reassuring myself, okay, just go back to sleep, everything's fine. I needed to get back to bed anyway and prepare for the next day of activities. I rolled over and nearly screamed. Someone was standing outside my window. It was a tall silhouette and not unlike the one I'd seen near the creepy cabin earlier that day. But I couldn't see any features, just this dark shape up against the trees. I scrambled out of bed and shook another staff member awake. Hey, look! He sat up and of course, once again, the figure was gone. I couldn't believe it, but the guy I woke up had told me he'd seen a figure out there too, on the very first night that we were here. Why didn't you tell anybody? I asked. Oh, I thought I was going crazy. I guess he was kind of right, because I feel like we were all going crazy at this point. By Friday, everybody knew something strange was going on. The tapping continued, the footsteps were constant, and nobody could find any kind of source. Then would come the final night. I woke up again around 3 in the morning, and for several seconds everything was quiet, and then I heard that scraping sound again. It was unmistakable. I have my wood carving badge. I know the sound of a blade scraping soft wood. I sat up immediately. It continued. It paused for another second and then continued again. It almost sounded like metal cutting into wood, and this time it wasn't outside the cabin wall. It was there in the room with us, and every hair on my body stood up. The sound lasted for several more minutes. They were making sure the mark was perfect, I guess, and it just stopped right before sunrise. In the morning, nobody could believe it. There were actual shavings all over the floor in the back corner, and near the bottom of the wall was this brand new, creepy symbol. Unlike the older carvings, it exposed timber and was pale, clean, very fresh, and nobody could explain it, and nobody volunteered to investigate it further either. There were still a few more days of camp left, and we didn't want to stay in that cabin anymore. The scoutmasters groaned at us, but eventually let us pack up and choose a new sleeping location. We would have gone all AWOL if they made us stay there another night, that's for sure. The cabin remained empty for the rest of the summer, and that was the easiest way to deal with the problem. Ignore it. I know what you're thinking. I know how my story sounds. It's far-fetched, it's random, it's not believable, but it happened, and I finished my week on staff and went home. But even to this day, I still think about that place. During the summer, I worked on staff at our local Boy Scout camp. I thought I'd just seen about everything at that point. The kids who tried to cook ramen on rocks with magnifying glasses. We had kids who attempted to paddle canoes across the lake after curfew. One scout somehow got his hands stuck inside this folding chair and then had to be cut out of it. After a few weeks, there was very little that surprised me. And then there's Eric. I'm standing in the dish room after lunch, elbow deep in greasy water, scraping mashed potatoes off metal trays. The kitchen's loud, plates are clattering. Somebody behind me is singing really badly, and through the steam-covered window above the sink, I catch a little bit of movement outside. At first, it doesn't really click, or I don't think much of it, and then I took note of who's walking together: the camp ranger, the program director, and 2 senior staff members, 3 counselors as well, all in the middle. And in the middle of all of this is a scout. The kid isn't handcuffed or anything, but the adults are surrounding him close enough that he's clearly not able to leave. This catches my attention and I stop scrubbing. "What's that about?" I ask out loud, but nobody seems to know. The group disappears toward the administration building. The ranger looks furious, the kid looks pale, and then everybody's gone. The rest of lunch is busy enough that I kind of forget about it until later that afternoon. Once the kitchen closes, I head down to the waterfront to waste some time before dinner. My buddy Nate is sitting on the picnic table throwing pebbles into the lake. I tell him about what I saw earlier, and his expression changes. "Oh," he says. "Oh, what?" I ask back. "You didn't hear?" "Hear what, dude? Just give me a crumb of context, please." Nate looks around before leaning a little closer. "They caught that kid trying to catch a rattlesnake." I laugh. That doesn't really seem too serious. "No way." "Dead serious. A rattlesnake?" "Yeah, a big one." The smile then fades from my face. Northern Michigan wasn't exactly famous for giant venomous snakes, but the camp sat on hundreds of acres of woods. Every summer, we'd see garter snakes, fox snakes, water snakes, and occasionally something a little more serious and/or dangerous. That's not the weird part, though, Nate says, reading my face. Okay, then what's the weird part? Stop burying the lead here. Why you get in trouble? They searched his tent. The way he implied it sounded like something sinister. I imagine this kid had caught himself 100 snakes and then hidden them underneath his pillowcase or something. What'd they find? Nate shook his head. A box. So? A box full of snakes. I stare at him. Okay, dude, so what? A box under his cot. At this point, it seriously seems like he's screwing with me. Then he starts listing them. A garter snake, a fox snake, a milk snake, several others nobody could identify immediately, and one fat copperhead. Bullshit, dude. I'm not joking, that's what the ranger said. A copperhead, seriously? Apparently. There's no way, they don't even live here. Bingo. That kid's in deep shit. The lake suddenly feels less relaxing now. Did he bring it from home? That's what they think. You gotta be kidding me. Nate shrugs. The ranger didn't seem too amused. Dinner comes and goes, and the story spreads across the camp like wildfire. By evening, everybody's talking about Snake Boy. Most people assume the story is exaggerated. Boy Scout camps run on rumors. Somebody sees a bear, and by bedtime, it's suddenly a grizzly. A kid hears a coyote, then suddenly it's a whole wolf pack. Stories grow in young imaginations. After taps, I'm walking back toward the staff village when I see lights moving through one of the campsites. Flashlights, several of them, and grown-up voices accompanying him. I stop, it's a counselor. And it's the one I know that's walking down the trail. Hey, what's going on? He looks exhausted. They're searching. Searching for what? Snakes. My stomach drops. Still? Still. Apparently, when they confronted Eric, he admitted there were more animals than they'd found initially, and nobody knew exactly how many. So now, hours after dark, counselors were combing through tents, gear piles, brush, and undergrowth, looking for any and every escaped snake. I watch the flashlights weave throughout the trees. The whole thing feels ridiculous. A counselor then suddenly yells and is panicked. Several lights converge and somebody shouts for the ranger. I proceed to the village and secure myself in my bunk for the evening. The next morning, the story somehow gets a little worse. I'm eating breakfast when one of the older counselors sits across from me. You know that kid who got sent home last week? Which one? The snake bite. I stopped chewing. I'd forgotten about that. A scout had been rushed to urgent care after waking up screaming in the middle of the night. The official explanation was that he'd rolled onto something in a sleeping bag and gotten bit by this unknown snake. It was treated as a weird accident. The kid went home, end of story. Except now the counselor is staring at me. Take a guess who his tent mate was. I already knew the answer. Oh shit. Yep, Eric. The counselor takes a sip of coffee. The ranger talked to the kid's parents yesterday. Don't tell me. The scout says he woke up during the night and saw Eric holding a snake. Nightmare fuel. What? Yeah, the kid thought he was dreaming. Suddenly, the dining hall feels very quiet. Apparently, Eric told him not to worry about it, to go back to sleep. I just stared at my food. What the fuck? He shakes his head. Yeah, what a Looney Tune. We kind of went quiet after that, not saying anything. Outside the dining hall window, scouts are heading toward morning merit badges. Canoes are moving across the lake. Birds are singing. Everything looks to be pretty normal. But now all I can picture is a kid lying in his tent while his tent mate sits awake in darkness with a collection of venomous snakes slithering over both of them. There's more, counselor says to me. Of course there is. When they searched his gear, they found all these jars. Jars? Yeah, he'd been trying to collect venom. I rub my face with both hands. What the hell? Yeah, From the copperhead? From anything that would bite. I set my head up against the table and the counselor then lowered his voice. Apparently, he'd been trying to milk venom into containers. Does anybody know why? No clue. And that question haunted everybody. My personal suspicion, he wanted to poison everybody at camp. He was going to pour the venom in those jars into our food, our water supply, anything he could make toxic. I don't know if that would actually work, but whatever the reason, the camp never saw him again. His parents came and picked him up that afternoon. The ranger personally escorted him to the parking lot. The remaining snakes were removed, and the campsite was searched repeatedly. Life returned to normal. And Eric became infamous among the staff members for many, many years after. After more than 20 years in the Boy Scouts, I have a pretty good idea of what to expect at a camp. Rainstorms that arrive without any kind of warning, a child forgetting their sleeping bag, a fox or raccoon digging through rubbish in the middle of the night, strange sounds in the woods that turn out to be a deer or another leader wandering around to pee. What I never expected to have on a scout camp risk assessment was a group of naked people chanting around a fire 50 meters from hundreds of sleeping children. And yeah, that's exactly what happened. Last year, during our district camp in Belgium, we rented a large scout-owned domain with rolling fields and patches of forest. I arrived a day early because the weather was perfect and I wanted a peaceful evening before roughly 500 campers arrived. When I got there, I noticed another group occupying a couple of neighboring fields. They were not scouts. They told me their name, but I can't remember it now. After the camp, I tried searching for them online and found pretty much nothing. I suspect they gave me some sort of false credentials. Yeah, simply put, they were odd. They spoke very little and kept to themselves. Most of their camp was around this large fire pit with old-looking equipment and tents. Most unsettling, at least, was their clothing. Even in warm weather, they wore these long dark robes that reached the ground. I remember joking that they looked like they had stepped directly out of the Middle Ages. That first night around 10 o'clock, the drumming begins. Starts with a single beat, then another joined it, then another. Soon the entire field was echoing with dozens of different rhythms and colliding together. Along with the drums came with what I'd described as, I guess, singing, although there was no melody or language that I could recognize. The sounds would rise and fall like somebody mourning, whispering, and then screaming all at the same time. It continued until nearly 3 in the morning. I was irritated and tired, but I assumed they were just some strange spiritual group having some form of a retreat. They had rented the field and were technically allowed to be down there. I was powerless to stop it from a legal perspective. Cut to the next day and our scouts arrive. Hundreds of children filled the domain with tents, games, and normal chaos of camp. The robe group stayed in their area, but they watched and their eyes found every child. And that was what disturbed me most. Whenever I looked over while carrying equipment or helping with some kind of setup, I would see several of them standing silently at the edge of their field. They were not talking, they were not smiling, they were just watching our camp, watching the children. If I acknowledged them, they never responded. They would simply continue staring until I looked away. The second night, those drums returned at 11 and continued until around 1 in the morning. Leaders started complaining. We had enough to manage with hundreds of youth and nobody wanted to make a scene. Saturday would be our traditional campfire night. It was a wonderful evening with songs, stories, and skits. Eventually, the kids go to bed, and by midnight, the camp was nice and silent. But then, yeah, you guessed it, of course those drums start right up again, and I'm shocked. I'm standing near a path talking with another leader when the first beat echoed through the darkness. Neither of us needed to say anything. We're both thinking the same thing. Not these people again. At this point, not gonna lie, I was genuinely angry. They had spent 2 days watching a scout camp with hundreds of kids. They knew exactly who was there, yet they chose midnight to begin this stupid ritual again. Around 1 in the morning, I tried to go to bed. One of the other leaders said he was too exhausted to come with me to complain, and Truthfully, I didn't want to walk over there alone. The next morning, I actually learned that several other leaders had gone over there to give these campers a piece of their mind. They walked toward the drumming expecting to tell a few inconsiderate campers to lower the noise. Instead, they found an entire group gathered around a fire and they were all completely naked. Their bodies were covered in dirt and ash. They moved in a circle around the flames, beating drums and making those same unnatural noises we heard every other night. Their heads were tilted up toward the sky, mouths hanging open, far wider than seemed to be comfortable. The strangest part was that they didn't react to the leader's presence at all. They didn't look over, they didn't acknowledge them, they didn't pause. They acted as though nobody else existed. The leaders didn't argue, they didn't ask any more questions, they just simply turned around and walked back to camp. I still have no idea who these people were or what they were doing. Perhaps there's a completely reasonable explanation for their quote-unquote ceremony, but I often think about the fact that hundreds of children were sleeping only a short walk away. I think about a scout waking up in the middle of the night, hearing those drums somewhere in the woods and deciding to go investigate for themselves. I'm very grateful that nobody ever did. If any of you listening has any information to what this could be, I'd love to hear your theories. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. I was in college when I let one of my friends talk me into helping with his scout troop as an assistant scoutmaster. It was early summer at the time, camping trip, nothing ambitious. We hiked about 1.5 miles up a mountain to a clearing and pitched some tents, and settled in for what was supposed to be this easy overnight. The forecast was calling for scattered thunderstorms, but nobody seemed to be too worried. By lunch, we knew the weather had it in for us. The air had gone heavy and cold, and storm clouds were stacking beyond the ridges and slowly growing darker. Throughout the afternoon, we watched them build. Every now and then, thunder would roll somewhere off in the distance, but no rain had arrived yet. The boys were playing cards, exploring the woods, and asked those usual questions. The adults continued to check the sky. By 6 o'clock, it looked like midnight. The entire clearing had turned black. The scoutmaster stood at the horizon and finally said, "I don't like this." We were debating whether to break camp when the first hard gust hit. It folded a tarp in half and then snapped a guy line. And then the rain finally arrived. It came down all at once, torrential. Within seconds, everybody was running for cover. I dove into a dome tent with several scouts and the wind began hammering at the fabric. The rainfly ripped loose almost immediately, water blasting through the mesh walls. All the sleeping bags were soaked within minutes. Outside tents were collapsing and boys were yelling over the storm. For 15 minutes straight, the weather beat us to pieces. The wind howled through the clearing, lightning flashed constantly, which I'll admit was scary, but also a blessing. One of the tents flattened completely with scouts still inside it. Another lost its rainfly as well and then disappeared into the trees. Every flash of lightning showed equipment tumbling throughout the camp. Then, off in the distance, I thought I heard what was wind. But then I listened harder and heard it again. It was tornado sirens. They were far away and coming from towns somewhere below the mountain, but there was no mistaking the sound. The scoutmaster heard them too, and his expression changed immediately. "We're leaving, right now." Nobody argued, but nobody moved either. "Go, go!" he hollered, ushering toward the trail. We dragged kids from tents and tried organizing them up in the storm. Some had boots on, some didn't. One kid kept trying to save his backpack and another was crying. Rain was hitting us so hard that it stung against exposed skin. With everything going on, it was incredibly stressful. We counted heads twice and then started moving. The trail downhill had become a river. Older scouts took off faster than they should have, while younger boys struggled behind them. We tried keeping everybody together, but visibility was awful. Headlamps were bouncing through the rain ahead of us while thunder drowned out every instruction we shouted. Lightning flashed every few seconds, showing us pieces of the trail before plunging everything back into darkness. Halfway down the mountains, something exploded from the brush, and for one terrifying second I thought people were running at us. But I quickly realized it was coyotes, a whole pack of them. They came pouring across the trail in the opposite direction, soaked and frantic, fleeing the storm, just like we were. There were at least 6 or 7 of them. They weren't hunting. They weren't interested in us. They were terrified, wild-eyed, and slack-jawed. The storm had probably washed them out of whatever den they'd been sleeping in. Unfortunately, terrified animals are still dangerous. One slammed into a scout and knocked him sideways. Another brushed past my leg and snapped at my boots. A kid screamed and stumbled away. A younger scout fell into his hands and knees as one coyote bounded over him, close enough to clip his shoulder. The others growled as they squeezed between the boys on the trail. For several seconds, everything was just chaos, pure panic. I thought we were about to get ripped to shreds. Rain and mud, growling in fangs, boys were shouting for their lives. I grabbed one of the scouts by the back of his shirt and hauled him upright before he got trampled. Lightning flashed again and illuminated an entire pack as they raced downhill through the trees. And then just like that, they were gone. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, if that. But I'll fully admit it felt like 10 minutes or longer. Nobody stopped running afterward either. Even the smaller boys were now running down with the older kids. And the storm was only seeming to get worse. Branches were crashing all around us, telling us that we still weren't alone. The wind was shoving us sideways. Every flash of lightning made me expect to see a tree coming down across the trail. Then thankfully we finally saw the parking lot, and I don't think I've ever been happier to see a row of cars. The boys piled inside without caring whose vehicle they entered. We started counting heads again immediately and then counted once more. Then one more time after that just to be sure everybody had made it. A few kids had scrapes and bruises, one had lost a shoe, another had a bloody nose from a fall. Everybody was soaked and shaking, but everybody was there. We remained in the cars while the storm outside raged overhead. Rain hammered everything, wind rocked the vehicles. Every now and then the distant tornado sirens rose up through the noise. After an hour or so, the weather settled into this steady rain, but there was no chance we were hiking back up. We spent the night in the parking lot. The next morning, though, we returned to camp and the clearing was a complete disaster zone. Tents were scattered everywhere. Rain flies had vanished completely. Packs, cookware, sleeping pads were spread across the hillside. Several of the tents had traveled nearly 300 yards because nobody had bothered staking them down properly. We searched around for missing equipment for hours. We never found the patrol bags. Off in the distance, we could see a section of trees that had been flattened. Later, we were told that a tornado never actually touched down. The damage itself had come from these straight-line winds. We've been lucky to make it down the mountain without any kind of injury. As you can imagine, that was my last adventure in the world of scoutmastering. Good luck out there, boys.